There are many different aspects of this path. There are those parts of this path that we practice in stillness. Sometimes we practice in stillness. Perhaps we sit. Perhaps we lie down. But in any case, we're in stillness. Certain aspects of this path that are easiest to practice in stillness. Certain parts of this path we practice as we move around, as we walk, as we cook or clean, as we converse, as we work. In our hobbies or projects or professions. Certain parts of the path that are easier to practice and cultivate then. It's often said that the path is like a multifaceted jewel. It's like a jewel that's cut carefully and beautiful on each side, each facet, each face of the gem reflects and sparkles in its own way. And we practice in that same way. Sometimes we are still and we maintain an awareness of inhaling and exhaling, and that's all. We set aside the goal to make this happen or to make that happen. We don't try to make our experience better than it is. We simply experience it as it arises, experience it as it passes away. And sometimes we practice with judgment, with good and bad. We want to behave in this way and not in that way. We want to do these things and not those things. We want to say skillful, caring words and not unskillful, uncaring words. We want to think intelligent, useful thoughts and not unintelligent, useless thoughts. We have the desire to make things be better, or at least to prevent things from getting worse. That also is part of this path. It is part of this. And it's important for us to be open to both sides of this practice, the side without judgment and the side with judgment. I have a friend in the path. I have a friend in the path. And we speak now and then on the phone. We've been physically together many times, but nowadays he's living very far away from me. Currently he's in Southeast Asia. And there was a time when we were talking on the phone, and he'd been practicing for a number of years at this point, and he'd been working very intensely with negative thought patterns. There are lots of different ways that we can work with negative thought patterns. Many different strategies exist. And he'd been working with negative thought patterns. And he had begun noticing that there were very intense thought patterns, mostly about himself, mostly negative thought patterns about himself, that were ruling his life, that were controlling his life. And he had started to work with those. Once he worked with those, he noticed that there were many other negative thought patterns that arose, certain kinds, for example, related to other people. He found that it was surprisingly unusual in his case, and it's very humble and honest of him to notice this and then voice it. Notice it was very unusual for him to have any awareness of himself without adding judgment to that awareness. And furthermore, it was very rare for him to have any awareness of anyone else without having some judgment. He was amazed. He became shocked at the fact that immediately upon meeting a new person, he was shocked, as I say, to notice that immediately upon meeting a new person, he was already judging them. They hadn't even spoken yet. Didn't know them at all, and yet he was already judging them. It was quite terrifying to him. And then he continued to pay attention to those thoughts, and he started noticing furthermore that most of them didn't make much sense. They just kept on happening. Even though he knew, logically, that they weren't rational, nonetheless they kept on happening. And then he noticed furthermore that a lot of the words he said were based on those thoughts. And then he noticed furthermore that a lot of his behaviors, in fact a lot of his lifestyle, was based on those thoughts. And at this point, he gave me a call. So you can see his practice was very deeply developed at this point. Isn't that clear? This is a person with a very deep practice. Because so much of what had been underneath the threshold of awareness had become apparent, and he hadn't just run screaming the other way. So he has a very deep practice, obviously. And he gave me a call, and we started talking about this. And he asked about my teacher. He said, so in the case, for example, of your teacher, who's a Japanese Zen master, he said, in his case, for example, if he's talking to someone, let's say he's sitting with someone talking, and they say something irrelevant or stupid. So is it the case that a judgmental thought arises in his mind, but then he's able to suppress it or transcend it even before he reacts to it? Is that how it works in his case? And I said, well, first of all, I have no idea how it works in his case. I don't know what is going on in his mind. I don't have that information. The more I've gotten to know him, the more I've seen that I don't have any idea how his mind works. But I can tell you what it looks like from my perspective. I've known him for many years. I can tell you what it looks like. I actually lived with him. I know him very well. I can tell you what it looks like from where I'm standing. That's all I can tell you. Would that be sufficient? And he said, of course, anything that you can tell me about this, I'm very interested. I said, okay, so I believe you asked if he's speaking with someone and they say something irrelevant or stupid and a judgmental thought arises, a self-centered thought, a thought of I'm better than this person, or this person is stupid or bad or flawed or messed up. If such a thought arises in his mind, then you're asking, is he able to suppress or transcend that thought even before he voices a comment based on that thought, or before he interacts with that person in a way that's motivated by that thought? Is that your question? And he said, yes, that's my question. And I said, okay, so from where I stand, from my standpoint, as far as I can tell, in the case of this individual, this spiritual teacher, that thought doesn't arise. So, my friend, as I said, is a very deep practice. He's a person of enormous integrity. If there were a single word, if you asked me to describe this person with just one word, the single word I would use is honest. He's an honest person. And he does his best to be honest with himself, as many of us do. We try very hard to be honest with ourselves, and sometimes we notice that that can be difficult, but we work hard on it anyway. And as a result of that honesty, he had made a great deal of progress on this path. Now, if we begin this path, we might have practiced this path for a little while, and we might ask a question, having just started this path. Might ask the same question that my friend asked, and a person might give the same answer that I gave. And if we've just started the path, then we might say something like, "That sounds pretty good. Sounds pretty good that someone would not just be able to transcend negative thinking, but actually not experience it. Sounds pretty good. It's amazing." If we practice a little bit more, we get to know ourselves a little bit better. We sit with ourselves for a little bit longer. Of course, it doesn't have to be sitting still. There are many different ways that we can practice this path. But if we pay close attention to our minds, then we might get to the point when, if we ask that question and get that answer, we might say something like, that's incredible. It's not just good. It's not just amazing. That's mind-blowing. That's shocking. That you would say that is bewildering. It's that amazing. It's simply incredible. Well, that's very good. We might take the path further. We might get to know ourselves even more. We might come to know our minds, our awareness, our patterns even more. And then we might ask the same question and get the same answer, and then we might answer with something like, well, that's impossible. That's just a stupid thing to say. Why would you claim? This path is already good enough. You don't have to make absurd claims. You don't have to make this idiotic claim that someone would be capable of purifying their mind so much that mental afflictions actually don't arise. Why would you even say that? It shows that you're stupid and that you're unrealistic. You're childish. You have no connection with reality if you would make a claim like that. So right now I'm describing the reaction of a person with a very deep practice. This is a person with a very deep practice. You see? This isn't an immature person. This is a person who's very, very self-aware. That's the reason that they would respond in that way. But Ben, oh, that's his name, sorry. Ben had an even deeper practice than that. And as I say, we were on the phone, and I gave that answer, and there was just silence. just silence. And he and I simply sat. We were both sitting at the time. And there was just silence. And after a minute or so, he finally simply said, "What?" This is a person with a very deep practice. This is a person with enormous integrity. Someone who could respond in that way. We walk this path. We maintain this practice. And as we walk this path and maintain this practice, we gradually, without rushing, and also without hesitating, without holding back, but without rushing, we receive, work with, and let go of each next pattern that we maintain in our lives. Each next pattern that we maintain, whatever those patterns are, each next pattern we work with, we improve that pattern. We carefully work with it in order to improve it so much that we can at some point then completely let go of it. Completely let go of it. As we sit and do a practice like the one we just did, as we sit and maintain, for example, mindfulness of breathing, we come to the point when more and more we are mindful of our breathing. It happens more and more. How often does it happen? It doesn't really matter, actually. That isn't a question that I see as particularly important. The point is that we are mindful of our breathing more and more. That's all. We simply can maintain more and more consistent mindfulness of our breathing. More and more often, while we're breathing in, we know I'm breathing in. More and more, while we're breathing out, we know I'm breathing out. That happens more and more often. And as that's happening more and more often, we're sitting still and we're not moving. So we're not doing anything that we don't regret. We're not speaking, we're just sitting here not talking. So we're not saying anything that we regret. We're not doing anything we regret, we're not saying anything we regret. And gradually, as we're more and more aware of our breathing, we think less and less, which means that we don't think things that we regret. Gradually, we think fewer and fewer things that we regret thinking. Just gradually. It's okay if it takes quite a long time. Maybe it takes a minute. Maybe that's a long time. Maybe it takes 50 years. Maybe that's a long time. Doesn't matter. It could take a long time. Could take a short time. Maybe that for you means a minute. Maybe that's a short time for you. That's okay. It could take a minute. Maybe 50 years. Maybe for you that's a short time. Could take 50 years. That's fine. We don't know if it's going to take a short time or a long time, but in any case, gradually we are more and more often aware of our breathing, and at that moment we're not thinking, we're not aware of a thought, which means we don't regret a thought, and we're not doing anything, we're not saying anything, we're not thinking anything more and more often, which means that we have less and less regret. And this experience of non-regret, just this experience of non-regret, just that experience of non-regret, something that most people don't know much about. Just be honest with you. Most people have never noticed how significant it is to experience even one moment of non-regret. Does anyone know what it feels like? Have absolutely no regret? There's a word for it. It's called rejoicing. It's an enormously energetic, joyful explosion of energy throughout your body. To simply not have regret for what you just did, said, or thought. Absolutely none. To have absolutely none is an enormously joyful experience. It's an extremely pleasurable experience. And it is absolutely not special in any way. There's nothing special about it. That's why the term non-regret is so useful. Because we see that the regret has been added on to that for our whole lives. That's been there. That's an absolutely natural, ordinary state. It's absolutely normal and ordinary. It's basic, it's foundational, it's not special in any way. There's nothing special about it. There's absolutely nothing special about it. It's just the most ordinary thing in the world. And when we have a connection with that, simple experience of non-regret, then we can settle in to that experience of joy. And when we settle into that experience of joy, we become concentrated, and that's, well, that's great. It's a very efficient path from that point forward. Have any of you ever heard of Milarepa? Milarepa is the most famous and celebrated of the Tibetan saints. He was asked once, what's the point of this path? He was asked that question once, what's the point of this path? And it's really great when someone asks someone like that, a question like that. It's really common that a good answer comes out of that. And he answered very, very sweetly, I think. It's Tibetan, so he's very sweet. He's very nice. The Tibetans are they're so good at saying deep things in simple ways. And he said, it's so nice the way he answered. I practice this path. It's answered like that. I practice this path in order to live and die without regret. That's why. There we are. I practice this path in order to live and die without regret. In order to be able to live this day without regretting it, and to be able to die today without regretting it. That's why I practice this path. This is a person, for your information, who had a hard time of it. Just for your reference. I'm not going to tell you his story, but trust me, he had a hard time. He did a lot of things he regretted. And he was treated very badly as a result. You can look up his story if you'd like. But he did, because he was willing to go through the process of regretting enough, he was able to come to the point when he no longer regretted. He was able to listen to the wisdom in his regret enough to work through the basic insecurity that had resulted in the behavior that caused that regret. He was able to listen to the wisdom in his regret deeply enough to work through the insecurity that had resulted in the actions and the words and the thoughts that had caused him that regret. Did you get that? It's important that you got that. Should I say it one more time? He was able to receive and metabolize and become the wisdom in his regret. He was able to fully experience the wisdom in his regret, the wisdom that was present in the experience of regret. He was able to experience that completely enough. He was regretting. He experienced that regret enough to receive the wisdom in it. We stay with it until we receive the wisdom in it. The wisdom in it. Typically, when we have regret, we don't experience it in a way that gives us a lot of wisdom. We use it to beat ourselves up and to abuse ourselves and to increase our level of insecurity, which then increases the likelihood that we're going to do something else that we regret. We use it in order to cultivate a vicious cycle that can easily spiral out of control. This is very common. And maybe you hear me saying this and you think, oh no, I do that, I regret that, I'm so bad, this is terrible, this is going nowhere, I'm never going to get anywhere, this is awful, I'm actually awful. That's an example of a common relationship we have with regret. Regret is difficult to develop a skillful relationship with, but it's very important to learn how to develop a skillful relationship with it, because if we can, then we can experience regret fully so that we experience the wisdom in it. The wisdom is simply our conscience. That's all it is. It's our conscience at play. That's what regret is. Regret is our conscience saying hi. And we listen and we say hi back. And with that wisdom that arises, we apply it to the basic insecurity, the basic underlying insecurity. The basic insecurity that we have, a very basic foundational insecurity, very basic. It's at the very bottom. It's a basic insecurity, a basic sense of, well, any word just scratches the surface of this. There are symptoms of it, but it's an underlying sense that I am basically flawed. I'm basically flawed. There's something basically wrong with me. And all the good stuff, I've covered that over, but really down below, I'm messed up. And I don't want to know about that. I don't want to go down there and find out about how really messed up I really am, because it's easier to just ignore that forever. And yet, if we don't take a look, then it may be true. And that makes us feel even more insecure. There's a basic insecurity, but if we receive the regret, receive the wisdom in that regret, then we can use that wisdom to deal with the basic underlying insecurity that caused the behavior and body, speech, or mind that gave us that regret. And we can end the cycle there. We can end it there. It's very important in order to do that we know how important our behavior is, that we pay attention to what we do and what we say and what we think, and we pay attention to the regret that we may have as a result of it, and that we pay attention to that in the big ways. For example, people in our culture have a lot more insecurity than in a lot of the cultures that I've lived in. Insecurity is very significant in our culture, and I think one of the reasons is that our culture, let's just face it, is based on violence, isn't it? Here we are. It's based on injustice, oppression, and violence. It just is. That's just how it is. We don't have to get all riled up about it, but we should take it seriously, because if the food that we're eating is based on the elimination of cultures and species, and so is the electricity based on global warming, and the land that we're living on is being used as a result of genocide, that's gonna provide us with a certain amount of insecurity. My life stability is based on injustice and violence. Now that's gonna cause an underlying insecurity. I believe that until we deal with and resolve those issues, insecurity will continue to be a foundational aspect of our minds. Now that's a big problem. It causes enormous suffering. And unfortunately, for most of us, it doesn't cause a form of suffering that helps us to resolve these problems. It actually causes a form of suffering that disables us from taking effective action. But when we sit here and we get to a point when we're not doing, saying, or thinking things that make us regret, then we experience a kind of joy that we discover directly is underneath. It's underneath the regret. You see how important that is? It's more foundational. that's a clue that maybe I'm not basically flawed. That maybe I'm not basically messed up. Maybe beneath the insecurity, there's joy. There's wholeness. There's truth. There's authenticity. There's kindness. Maybe. It's a clue. And when we have that clue, we have a little bit more confidence. And we come out of the practice period and live our lives in a way that we can notice the places where we're feeling a little bit regretful about how we behaved. We can adjust that, and when we adjust that, that gives us even more self-confidence so that we can sit down and even more deeply experience our own minds to discover what's really at the base. This path brings us to the point when we can experience, directly experience, not indirectly, not read a book about it, but directly experience what's at the bottom, what's at the base, what's at the foundation, who we, quote, truly are. And when we have that direct experience, then we have an experience of freedom. And what happens when we're free? What happens when we're free? It's very important to know that for ourselves. It's very, very important to know that for ourselves, and that's why we come and sit. It's also why we then leave and live. We leave and live in a way that's compassionate, so that it is possible for us to live and die without regret.